Hey guys, welcome back. Son of a gun, it's hard to make a short video. You wouldn't credit how many times I've recorded this intro. This video is the short one. This is the one that just takes you through the automatic bed leveling user interface, shows you where it's at, shows you how it's used, shows you the results, and I'll even take you through printing the bed verification pattern to prove that the bed leveling we did, in fact, gave us a mesh that is good for printing. There'll be a second video, and that one will not be short. I can tell. That one will talk about what goes wrong, and when it goes wrong, what might you be able to do about it. But this one is all good news. So let's go. So these are the main players in the CR6 bed leveling system. There's an optic sensor down here at the bottom left corner on the CR6. The little red light there confirms the power is attached, and when you place something between the two bars on the sensor, that little light goes out. I'm not hiding it, it's actually switching off there. In this case, the design the printer has a target fixed here to the x-axis. As the x-axis comes down, that target is introduced between the two bars, and at that point a signal goes to the motherboard through this harness to the Z end stop connector on the motherboard. Marlin is programmed in the code to use the signal from this sensor to change the speed with which the Z-axis is descending. It will slow it down as this target enters the sensor, and it will tear the probe, and it will monitor the probe for a bed strike. You can take that out of Marlin's code, you can actually bypass that, but that's the way it's programmed by default. In the Clipper implementation that we're using, we don't use the sensor at all. But the probe will also trigger on the daughter board a signal back to the motherboard as an end stop when it actually strikes the bed. And Marlin's coded to ignore that signal unless it has seen this one first. So if this signal is not received by Marlin, let's say it's plugged into the wrong socket on the board, or its wire is broken or disconnected, then Marlin does not process the end stop signal from the daughter board, and it will in fact allow the nozzle to strike the bed and keep going. That situation has been a bit of a pickle for some people who changed their motherboard, say from a 452 to a 453 board, because Creality changed which socket, which pin that connector is fastened on for the 453 board, and some users have the wrong motherboard firmware installed, so that signal fails. It's always worth testing. If you've made major changes like that, put an obstacle before the nozzle strikes the bed underneath the nozzle and make sure the little blue light comes on. Make sure that the firmware processes that signal, and be ready on the power switch to fire it all off if such is not the case. Now on my printer I've converted to direct drive, and the daughter board here is mounted at a different angle on a bracket, but it's the same daughter board. The gauge that's going to detect a deflection of the nozzle is plugged into the daughter board here, and just above this mounting screw you see a little blue light flashing there. If I put any tension at all on the fitting where the Bowden tube would normally come in, or where the filament comes in on my direct drive, the little blue light comes on. Like that. Which means that the gauge is getting deflected enough just by putting tension in the activating direction to trigger the sensor. And that's why we tell you it's best to do ABL without anything in here, so that we know there's no tension being applied outside of gravity on the mass of the extruder motor on the gauge in my case, but no tension being applied at the top end, and that any activation will only be a result of pressure up from the bottom on the nozzle, like that. You also want to make sure there's no filament residue on the tip of your nozzle and no filament in the hot end, because you don't want any drool getting in the way and getting trapped between the nozzle and the bed when you start probing. So you can use a small wire brush just to clean off the nozzle while it's warm and make sure there's no filament in the hot end before you start the probing. So to navigate to the automatic bed leveling, calibrate button, maybe with the icon making it a bit more obvious. You select the icon, and up at the top here is automatic bed leveling. Go here. And on the automatic bed leveling screen we have a variety of functions. So let me just walk you through. Here at the top is Z offset. That's a different function from ABL. Okay, the two combined, the offset and the mesh that you build with this ABL function, are combined during printing to keep the nozzle at the right height from the bed. But this is the offset function. You use that by itself. To trigger the ABL, you just push this nice big button here, and that will run ABL for you. After you've run ABL, you can view the mesh. Right, so view leveling mesh displays the last mesh that I collected with the automatic bed leveling function. And by the way, from that screen you can actually edit the values. So I could change that from 0.065, let's say it's not working well for me, and I think 0.055 might be smarter. I can change it to 0.055. Alright? I won't do that because it's actually just fine the way it is. This is also achievable during printing now. It's accessible from the print tuning menu when you're running 6.1. And when I'm ready to do leveling of any sort, and that includes homing, because homing moves the entire mesh up and down according to where the home value is, there are leveling settings here. So let's have a quick look at those. Up at the top is something enigmatically labeled better accuracy. If you read the release notes, you'll understand that the better accuracy has to do with how accurately we think the probe will work if we reduce the amount of electromagnetic interference in the neighborhood of the probe while we make the actual measurements. And we do that by turning off the nozzle heater. So people who are not familiar with the firmware, they put it on, they run bed leveling, they go, hey, what the heck? My temperatures are going up and down. Is that normal? And on the FAQs, that's now the very first question at the top of the page, in the hopes that it helps folks realize, yes, it's perfectly normal, but you can make it stop doing that. If you don't like that idea, or you don't agree with the devs that it's better, turn it off here, and you won't see the temperature cycle anymore. That was under leveling settings. The devs recommend you leave that on for better performance. But you could test that yourselves. Maybe your electromagnetic interference environment is different from that of the devs. Try making your bed measurements with that switched off, and if it works just fine, leave it off. These are the temperatures that the leveling circuit will use. So each time you say go home, it takes your nozzle temperature to 145 and the bed to 55 according to these settings. And if you want different values, you change them here. These are the default values. I have one switched off here because I prefer it, but there, stabilize temperature after probing. That's a reference to after homing and before I return to XY0 to start printing, bring my probe temperature, my nozzle temperature back up to where I set it. Okay? Otherwise, if I turn that off, it'll simply come back to XY home after homing, and then it'll raise the temperature and away it goes. Fade height, that's at what point does the bed leveling fade away as a fact. Between Z equals 0 and that height, the compensation applied by the bed mesh is being systematically and linearly reduced until it goes to zero at, in this case, 10 millimeters. So those are all your leveling settings. They were right there under the calibrate menu on the button at the bottom, just above the temperatures, right there. Now let's go in and run automatic bed leveling. First thing it does is zero the previous mesh, and I'm running, as I say, I'm running the refactored firmware, so mine will look a little different from yours. And there's one screen. On the 6.1 or bundled interface firmware, those squares where the values will be displayed were all turned white, and the zeros are therefore invisible. Then as each point is probed, the box goes black, and you see whatever value was measured. And if it's 0, you see zeros, and if it was some other value, you see that. I couldn't reproduce that in the refactored firmware. It turns out the feature that's used to animate that must have been deprecated in the new tool. So here you will see the zeros because I just made all the boxes black, and I don't see that as an issue. It's just different. You see the throbber? Love that throbber. It tells me don't lose faith. I'm actually heating things up. I'll be ready soon. So you can see the temperatures down at the bottom there. We're waiting for the bed to get to the temperature we've asked for. And my nozzle is overshooting a little bit. Maybe time to pit, and maybe it doesn't matter. So all the time I'm waiting for that. A little bit boring. Let's just watch that little red light in the bottom left corner. There she goes. Lights out. Blue lights on. I have mine probing twice at each point. So now it's home. You see this screen, right? All gone to zeros. And as it starts to probe, it will update each value in turn. You can see the nozzle temperature going to 0 each time it probes. The probe is also being tared just before it is sent in to make the measurement. So that when that little red light's gone out, it's also told the firmware to tear the probe. But it's doing it before each probe. And just to be clear, that probe remains between the two targets. It stays, the red light stays off once probing has begun, once the leveling has begun. There it is. All happy with itself. It's finished making the measurements. And there's my bed mesh. You'll notice some some minus signs and some with no sign in front, which is a positive number. Everything is below 0.0 something. So 0.1 something total distance between the lowest and the highest. No particular distribution of highs and lows suggesting any kind of a physical bias on the bed or on the x-axis being twisted, so I'm going to consider that good to go until I run my bed verification pattern to be sure it's actually printing with those numbers evenly across the bed. Now some people ask that, Does it matter if you do offset first and then leveling, or leveling first and then offset? And truly, from a Marlin point of view, the answer is no. Marlin doesn't use the offset when it's running bed mesh leveling, and the bed mesh is not in the game when you're measuring offset. The two things are independent of one another. It's only when you come to print that the automatic bed leveling itself, that's constantly raising the head up and down to keep it the same distance from the bed everywhere on the bed, is combining those two values to make its calculations. It uses them both. So the offset, in effect, causes the entire mesh to move up and down with the same shape that you captured as a mesh in the first place, but at a different height, let's say, from the bed. It'll go up and down by the amount of the offset. And that's how that works. So now we want to make sure that our mesh is valid, that we're actually going to get level printing right across the bed. And to do that, one of your options is to simply pull a pattern into the slicer, set your settings any way you like, and print the pattern from your slicer. But there's a code in Marlin called G26, G code. If you look that up, it has quite a bit of functionality. You might enjoy messing around with it, especially if you have other printers. But this one, with the community firmware, we baked in the print test pattern using G26. We threw it a few parameters, and there are some cautions I think you need to follow if you're going to get a satisfying result. If you select the menu item, let me back out here so you can see what's going on. Alright. You have a couple of parameters that will be fed to the routine when you push the go button. At what temperature do you want the nozzle to be operating? That's a function of the filament you put in. And at what bed temperature would you like it so that you get good adhesion on the pattern? I'm using PLA, so the 205 and 60 will work fine for me. The offset is the one that I selected, and I'm going to run the validation pattern. But you don't see percent flow as an option here. And unfortunately, PLA often over extrudes on my system with my Dragon high flow if I don't set the flow rate to something more like 92-93%. So we may see a clearly over extruded test pattern, which might tempt some people to increase the offset, thinking what's happening is the nozzle is too close to the bed. So you are probably better off running this pattern with PETG or ABS, which you can run, say on my system, 96% flow on PETG or 98 to 100 on the ABS. That's just a note of caution. That's a limitation of the pattern, the way it has been baked in. G26 does not offer percent flow as one of the switches. So running from a slicer might be more rewarding experience for you. It might be a more meaningful test. But to be fair and complete the demo, let me start by showing you run validation pattern. It will do the thing, right? It'll go to the temperatures I asked for. Those are the homing temperatures, because we set that under probe settings, leveling settings, the 145 and the 55. But when it starts the pattern, it'll use the temperatures we asked for. This is just getting ground zero established, what is home. In the interest of speed, I'm going to speed this up in the playback. Well, now we are homing. You'll see the G26 moves a little more slowly than you're probably set up to move. Well, it's one way you know that the code is running. Now, another caution on my system, I have some changes implemented that are still pending on the community firmware. It's going to drool a fair amount just before it starts. I told it to extrude a bit. That'll help me grab whatever was leaking out of the nozzle. It's also going to start drawing the pattern on a full circle, somewhere towards the center, and not in the front left corner, which is what will happen on your system. It'll go to the front left corner. I discovered with experimentation that for whatever reason, the extrusion in the front left corner was always poorly made if it started there, but if it started on a full circle first, it did that quite well, and then if it came to the front left corner after the fact, it made the front left corner quite well as also. So it tried to draw a purge line, but I had not fed the filament in first. Oh, that's not going well. That was PET G left over from the previous print. And PET G requires a higher adhesion temperature, so okay. So a little bit of PET G residue in my nozzle from the previous print. I thought that was clean. So the test pattern is a combination of circles, pads, and lines joining the pads together. It should all adhere, it should all be printed with equal thickness. No thin spots, no unadhered portions. It should all just come out as a clear pattern on the bed, well adhered. So what you're seeing really is over extruded. And that's where I cautioned you that the flow rate is too high here at 100%, and it's not a variable for me on the pattern. As long as you're getting good adhesion, you know that the offset is not too high. And from a bed mesh testing point of view, when all of the pads look equally, in this case, either over extruded or too close, at least you know the mesh is good, because the mesh is valid everywhere, and the only thing that might be wrong is the offset, but the offset is not wrong because the lines are adhering well, and they're not squished out or scraped up. So this is an indication that 100% flow is not the right setting for this particular filament. If you use a slicer, of course, you can set the flow to a different value and get the results you're looking for. So I did want this video to be relatively short. I will not make you watch this in real time. I'll speed it up and get to the end. So if you'll notice, the arcs along the sides, as the nozzle pulls away from the bed each time, it's drawing a little bit of filament up with it. So you end up with a raggedy edge. That may be a sign that adhesion is not quite good enough in my current setup. I didn't wash my bed before I did this. The G26 code does use retraction. One of the concerns with direct drive is the retraction setting, and this pattern may be a little high for what you should be using with your nozzle. Folks with the Micro Swiss all metal hot end may also be concerned that you're getting maybe 4 millimeters of retraction here, not the 3.5 or less, or the 1.5 in my case that you're trying to be using. In practice, I haven't found this pattern to clog my nozzle at all, but be aware that's why there's a note on the top of the screen here. Now on your screen it may say 0.6, but in truth it is 0.4. I've corrected that note again in one of the pull requests that I submitted against 6.1, so at the next release, if all goes well, that note will be updated to 0.4. And in fact, at the next release, I negotiated for control over that parameter, so there's actually in the configuration setup a parameter that will allow you to specify the the multiplier that is used on retraction to get it down to numbers that don't frighten you anymore. I say, in practice it hasn't proven to be the problem that in theory it might be. So others may have tried this pattern already, and you may find that what I'm showing you as results here are different from yours. Hopefully this looks to me as though it's all going to confirm that the mesh was valid. It is drawing a pad at each mesh point. I'm running low on battery here, so I'm fighting the camera a bit. And again, although G26 does use retraction, it seems as though they wrote the code in a way that the final retraction is not applied. So you will watch it draw a long thread off the end of its final stroke. It's not a problem with your system, that's a function of G26 and the way it was written. There we go. One reliable thread always drawn at the end of the pattern here. And there you go. Go freehand for a minute. One complete pattern drawn with equal thickness at all the pads, and to keep repeating myself, those little lumps in the middle are signs of over extrusion. The tracks that you see are signs of over extrusion. It is not because the nozzle's too close to the bed, which would have resulted in scraping. It's a function of the PLA that's been used at 100% flow rate. Okay, so there's the validation pattern baked into the user interface. And that's it, guys. You've seen the calibrate menu in its entirety now, including all the details of how to run a mesh leveling and how to do a validation print to check that your mesh is valid. Now you're down to printing. Enjoy!